On the night of March 13, 1871, a crowd gathered in Binghamton, New York. Men, women, even children pressed together outside the county jail, their breath visible in the cold air. At precisely 11:15 a.m. the following morning, they would witness something that newspapers across America called the last of his kind. Inside, Edward H. Rulloff, scholar, teacher, thief, murderer, awaited his execution by hanging. He was 50 years old, his hair streaked with gray, his sharp eyes still burning with the arrogance of a man who had long believed himself untouchable. Some called him the genius of crime, others labeled him the monster of the century, but most simply knew him by the name that would forever stain history, the genius killer. Edward Rulloff's life was a contradiction. He was, by all accounts, one of the most brilliant men of his age, a self-taught linguist who claimed to have solved mysteries of language that had eluded scholars for centuries. He could memorize entire books, translate obscure dialects, and dazzle anyone who spoke with him about philosophy, history, or science. And yet beneath that brilliance lay a predator, a man who manipulated friends, betrayed students, and most infamously murdered his own wife and child before turning his intelligence toward crime. For nearly 3 decades, he eluded justice, living a double life that fascinated and horrified the nation. His story raises haunting questions. Can genius and evil exist in the same man? How much weight should brilliance carry when weighed against blood? And why did so many continue to defend Edward Rulloff long after his crimes became undeniable? This is the story of the genius killer, a man whose name still echoes in the strange intersection of crime and intellect. Edward Rulloff was born in 1819 in Elmira, New York, though some records place his birth in Tioga County. His family were working-class farmers, not scholars or men of wealth, but from the beginning Edward stood apart. While other children spent their days playing along the river or tending fields, he pored over whatever scraps of print he could get his hands on. He memorized long passages of scripture, studied almanacs as if they were holy texts, and quickly gained a reputation for having a mind that could recall anything it encountered. Even in childhood, people whispered that he was different. The small schoolhouse he attended in his early years could not contain him. Lessons in arithmetic and penmanship bored him, and when teachers struggled to answer his questions, Edward's contempt was obvious. He considered himself destined for more than rural life. He borrowed books whenever possible, studying late into the night by candlelight. Before he turned 20, he had taught himself Latin, dabbled in Greek, and begun a self-directed study of anatomy, medicine, and natural sciences. His obsession, however, was language. Edward became consumed with the idea that he could uncover the original roots of human speech, a universal key to all languages. This theory grew into what he called the philosophy of language, and in his mind it would place him among the immortals of history. Newton had revealed the laws of gravity, Galileo the laws of the heavens, and he, Edward Rulloff, would solve the laws of human thought. This belief in his destiny hardened into arrogance. He came to regard teachers, neighbors, even his family as inferiors. If he was chosen to accomplish something great, why should he bend to the rules that bound common men? This mindset would shape the rest of his life. Edward considered morality, law, and even love as tools, useful only when they advanced his mission. He did not see people as ends in themselves, but as instruments to his own progress. When he worked as a school teacher in his 20s, he dazzled communities with his intellect but won few admirers. Parents respected his knowledge, but students feared his severity. He was quick to anger, quick to ridicule, and had little patience for those who could not keep up. It was during this period that Edward began forming a pattern that would repeat again and again: charm and manipulation followed by betrayal. He cultivated friendships with wealthier men, borrowing books or money that he rarely returned. He attracted women with his intelligence, but always treated them with a cold sense of superiority. He did not want equals, he wanted admirers, subordinates, and instruments of his will. In 1844, Edward married a young woman named Harriet Schutt from Ithaca, New York. She was described as gentle, intelligent, and entirely devoted to him. To her family, he must have seemed a promising husband, educated, ambitious, and hungry for success. But Harriet soon learned that she was not a partner in Edward's grand vision. She was property. Edward demanded obedience, resented contradiction, and often ruled their home with threats. He expected Harriet to adapt her life completely to his goals. If she questioned him, he silenced her. If she resisted, he grew violent. Not long after the marriage, Harriet gave birth to a child. To neighbors, it may have appeared that the young couple was starting a respectable life together, but something darker was already brewing beneath the surface. Harriet began to disappear from social circles. She stopped visiting relatives. Friends who called on the couple often found Harriet absent or strangely subdued, and then one day she and her child were simply gone. When family members asked questions, Edward had ready answers. Harriet had gone to visit relatives. Harriet was ill. The story shifted depending on who was asking, but what remained constant was Edward's unshakable confidence. His intelligence and self-possession discouraged suspicion. Who would dare accuse a man of such obvious brilliance of something so horrific? Neighbors whispered, but they lacked proof. The truth, which would only surface much later, was that Harriet and her infant had not left. They had been murdered. By the mid-1840s, Edward was living two lives. To one world, he was a scholar of rare ability, a man working on a monumental theory of language. To another, he was a husband whose wife and child had vanished under suspicious circumstances. And to lawmen who had begun to track his movements, he was a thief and a fraud with a knack for slipping through the cracks of justice. Whenever challenged, Edward framed himself as a victim of misunderstanding. If neighbors pressed him about Harriet, he dismissed them with contempt. If the law caught up to him for theft, he insisted his work was too important to be interrupted by petty accusations. He told anyone who would listen that his studies were not for himself but for mankind, and that interfering with him was like interfering with progress itself. He cloaked his cruelty and selfishness in the mantle of genius. This double life became his pattern for the next 25 years. He would be arrested, escape, imprisoned, freed. He would lecture men on philosophy in the same week that he stole from them. He would speak to students of the nobility of learning while secretly plotting his next crime. His intelligence gave him cover, and his arrogance gave him the nerve to believe he could always outthink the law. But the truth was inescapable. Harriet and the child were dead, and Edward carried that secret with him into every chapter of his life. He had crossed the line from arrogance into blood. He had proven to himself that even murder could be justified if it served his destiny, and if the life of his wife and child meant nothing to him, no life would be safe from the ambitions of the genius killer. By the summer of 1845, the absence of Harriet and her infant daughter could no longer be ignored. Her family had stopped receiving letters. Neighbors who once saw her tending a small garden or walking with the child now realized months had passed since anyone had spoken to her. When questioned, Edward maintained the same cold certainty that had always disarmed suspicion. Harriet, he claimed, had gone away to visit relatives. She had fallen ill. She had left him altogether. The story shifted from person to person, but always carried the same dismissive tone. He seemed insulted that anyone would question him at all. Harriet's brother grew restless. He visited Edward and demanded answers. Edward told him that Harriet had gone traveling and was in good health. When pressed further, Edward turned defensive and angry, suggesting that the family had no right to pry into his affairs. For most men, the inconsistencies in his explanations would have been damning. For Edward, his sheer confidence, his sharp tongue, and his air of intellectual superiority were enough to cow many who might have pursued the matter further. Who would accuse a man working on a great philosophical project of something as crude as domestic violence or murder? In a time when women had little voice, and men of intellect carried unearned authority, Edward's arrogance was shield enough, yet whispers persisted. Harriet had not written home. She had not visited relatives. No one had seen her. By the autumn of that year, those closest to her privately concluded what they dared not accuse aloud. Harriet and her child were dead, and Edward had killed them. But without bodies, without witnesses, and against the intimidating force of Edward's personality, the truth was left to rot in silence. Behind closed doors, Edward had indeed grown violent. Harriet, weary of his control and constant demands, had begun resisting him. She threatened to leave, to take the child and return to her family. For Edward, this was unthinkable. He considered Harriet not as a partner, but as property. To lose her would be to lose control, to lose face, and to expose his failure as a husband. He chose the path that many tyrants choose when power is threatened: elimination. At some point in 1845, he murdered both Harriet and the child. How he disposed of their bodies remains one of the darker mysteries of his story. Some accounts suggest they were buried near Cayuga Lake. Others claim he sank them in the water. Wherever they were placed, they were never found, and Edward never confessed to the details. The killings hardened him. If he had once been merely arrogant, now he was untouchable in his own mind. He had taken the ultimate step, snuffing out lives to preserve his control, and had walked away unpunished. He had proven, to himself at least, that he was beyond law, beyond morality, beyond suspicion. From this point forward, the barrier between thought and action was dissolved. Theft, manipulation, betrayal, all were permissible. Murder itself was not a crime but a tool, just another method of ensuring his destiny. After Harriet's disappearance, Edward drifted further into crime. He continued teaching at times, presenting himself as a respectable scholar, but in the shadows he began associating with thieves and swindlers. He was arrested for theft in 1846 and sentenced to a term in Auburn prison. Even there, his arrogance shone. Other prisoners described him as aloof, constantly boasting of his intelligence and his linguistic theories. Guards reported that he spent his time lecturing anyone who would listen about his grand discovery of the roots of human language.
To Edward, prison was not punishment. It was inconvenience, a temporary interruption of his work, an insult by lesser men who could not grasp his greatness. Upon release, he returned to Ithaca, but suspicion still clung to him. Harriet's family continued to press for answers. Some even tried to bring the matter before authorities, but with no physical evidence and no confession, there was little to pursue. Edward, meanwhile, carried on as though nothing had happened. He lectured. He boasted of his progress in linguistics. He manipulated young men into becoming his companions, and in time, his criminal partners. In the 1850s, Edward's schemes grew bolder. He formed a small band of thieves who operated under his guidance. They robbed homes and businesses across upstate New York, always with Edward at the center, directing, planning, and benefiting. He was not a common criminal skulking in alleys, at least not in his own mind. He styled himself as the intellectual leader of his band, the brains who elevated theft into strategy. His companions, often younger and less educated, saw him as a mentor. Some believed his boasts of linguistic breakthroughs and felt honored to follow him. Others, more cynical, followed because his plans usually succeeded. But not all of them ended well. In 1848, he was arrested again, this time for burglary. He served additional years behind bars, emerging in the mid-1850s, older, grayer, but no less convinced of his superiority. His time in prison had given him more hours to refine his linguistic theory. He had notebooks filled with words, roots, and grand declarations about his discovery. In his mind, he was building a legacy that would one day outshine the petty accusations of theft or even murder. By the
Edward had fully embraced his dual existence. In the daylight, he was the eccentric scholar, speaking with professors, dazzling students, even publishing fragments of his theories. At night, he was the mastermind behind robberies that stretched across counties. His criminal circle shifted as men came and went, but Edward remained constant. He had learned how to manipulate loyalty with a mix of charisma and fear. He spoke of brotherhood and mutual success, but always in ways that left him in command. Still, Harriet's shadow lingered. Her family never stopped whispering. Her absence was a wound that never healed, and Edward's vague, contradictory explanations only deepened suspicion. At times he even seemed to relish their discomfort, smiling thinly when questioned, reminding them that without proof they had nothing. It was as if he drew power from the silence, from the fact that he had killed and yet remained untouchable. In truth, Harriet's death was the pivot of his life. Before her, Edward was arrogant but contained, a man of dangerous ideas but limited action. After her, he became something darker. He had tested the boundaries of law and morality and found them weak. He had destroyed the lives of the people closest to him and had suffered no consequence. That knowledge emboldened him, giving him the confidence to push further, to steal more, to manipulate more, and eventually to kill again. By the late 1860s, Edward Rulloff was no longer just a suspicious figure in Ithaca or Elmira. He had become a name known across New York State. Scholars debated his theories of language. Criminals whispered of his cunning. Families remembered Harriet and the baby who never came home, and lawmen who had pursued him across decades and counties knew in their bones that Edward was dangerous. But even then, none could yet see the full picture of the man who would soon be known as the genius killer. By the late 1860s, Edward Rulloff had lived almost a quarter century as a man of two faces. To scholars, he was the eccentric linguist with a mind that could dazzle anyone who heard him speak. To lawmen, he was a dangerous thief who had managed to elude lasting punishment time and again. And to the few who remembered Harriet and her vanished child, he was a murderer walking free. But Edward, emboldened by years of survival, had no intention of stopping. He was certain that the world was not finished with him, that his great discovery in the science of language would eventually redeem everything. Until then, he needed money. In the summer of 1870, Edward assembled a small crew of young criminals in Binghamton, New York. They were men in their 20s, impressionable and desperate, drawn in by Edward's charisma. He offered them more than just leadership. He spoke of loyalty, of a brotherhood bound by higher purpose, of daring schemes that would enrich them all. He flattered their intelligence, telling them they were chosen for tasks that only the clever and the brave could attempt. And beneath it all was the same pattern that had defined his life: Edward as the mind, others as the hands, and the risk falling on anyone but himself. That summer, the crew plotted a robbery of Halbert's dry goods store, a well-stocked establishment in downtown Binghamton. The plan was simple on paper. Under cover of night, they would break in, haul away valuable merchandise, and disappear before dawn. The goods could be sold quickly, providing the money Edward needed to continue his studies and maintain his independence. For the younger men, it was a chance at quick fortune under the guidance of a man they believed was too intelligent to fail. On the night of August 1770, the plan was put into motion. Edward and two of his accomplices crept toward the store in the small hours of morning.
But what they had not anticipated was that Halbert's clerk, a man named Frederick Merrick, was still inside. He had stayed late, working through inventory. As the thieves broke in, Merrick startled them. A struggle erupted, chaos in the darkened store, blows were exchanged, and then, in an instant that would seal Edward's fate, Merrick collapsed, struck down by the intruders. The sound of violence carried into the street. Within minutes, townspeople had gathered, lanterns in hand, weapons ready. Edward and his men bolted into the night, pursued by shouts and the echo of hurried footsteps. They fled down alleys, across yards, trying to vanish into the darkness. One was captured quickly, another was shot dead as he ran, and Edward, the supposed mastermind, was finally caught and hauled to the jailhouse in Binghamton. The news spread fast. Within a day, every paper in New York State carried the headline: a scholar, a linguist, a supposed man of genius, arrested for murder in a botched burglary. Crowds gathered outside the jail, demanding to see him, to glimpse the man who had lived such a strange and sinister double life. Some came out of outrage, others out of morbid curiosity. It was not every day that a man once praised as one of the most brilliant minds of his generation was dragged through the mud as a common killer. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational of the 19th century. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators, reporters filled the benches, scribbling down every word. Edward, ever the intellectual, relished the attention. He delivered speeches from the dock, argued with attorneys, and even attempted to outwit the judge. He painted himself as a misunderstood genius, hounded by lesser men, persecuted because of his brilliance. He admitted nothing, denied everything, and attempted to twist the case into a battle of intellect rather than a question of blood. But the evidence was undeniable. Witnesses placed him at the scene. His accomplices, desperate to save themselves, testified against him. The stolen goods were recovered, linking him directly to the crime. And above all, the dead body of Frederick Merrick lay as silent proof that Edward's schemes had crossed once again into murder. The prosecution knew they had more than a simple burglary gone wrong. They had a man whose reputation as a criminal genius stretched back decades, a man suspected of murdering his own wife and child, a man who had escaped justice for far too long. They leaned into this image, portraying Edward as a calculating predator who hid behind intellect. This was not a mistake, they argued, not an accident. It was the culmination of a life spent exploiting others, a life of arrogance, manipulation, and blood. Edward's defense attempted to counter with appeals to his scholarship. They called on academics who had admired his work in linguistics. They produced manuscripts and notes as evidence of his brilliance. Some even argued that it would be a tragedy for civilization to execute a man who might hold the key to unlocking the mysteries of language. Was it right, they asked, to extinguish such a mind over the death of one clerk in a robbery gone wrong? The jury was unmoved. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, they returned with the verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence was death. Edward, ever composed, showed no fear when the decision was read. In fact, some reporters noted that he seemed to savor the attention, as though the spectacle of his trial and execution would secure him the immortality he craved. He continued to write in his cell, refining his theories on language. He granted interviews, lecturing journalists on philosophy and science, speaking of his discoveries with the same confidence he had always carried. To the end, he insisted that history would remember him not as a criminal, but as a man of ideas. But for the people of Binghamton, of Ithaca, of Elmira, and across New York, the picture was clear. Edward Rulloff was no misunderstood genius. He was a killer who had cloaked himself in brilliance. He had betrayed trust, destroyed families, and spilled blood. His theories, whatever their merit, were forever tainted by the lives he had taken. On March 3, 1871, Edward Rulloff was led to the gallows in Binghamton. A crowd gathered, thousands strong, pressing forward to witness the end of the man whose name had filled newspapers for months. He climbed the steps with calm, his head held high. When asked for final words, he once again spoke of his work, of the injustice of his sentence, of the tragedy that the world would lose his mind. At 11:15 a.m. the trap was sprung. Edward Rulloff's body fell, and with it, the long tangled saga of brilliance and blood came to an end. The crowd dispersed, some satisfied, some shaken, but all certain they had witnessed the last chapter of a man whose genius had been consumed by darkness. When Edward Rulloff's body swung lifeless from the gallows that March morning in 1871, the crowd that had gathered to see him die did not simply disperse into silence. They carried away with them stories, arguments, and uneasy reflections. Was he a monster, a genius, a cautionary tale of brilliance wasted, or was he proof that intelligence alone does not make a man good? Newspapers across the United States seized on the contradictions. Some headlines called him the learned murderer. Others branded him the most intelligent criminal who ever lived. For weeks after his death, his name was debated in editorials, sermons, and taverns. The execution had ended his life, but it had not ended his grip on the public imagination. Almost immediately, scientists and academics began arguing over the preservation of his brain. The new science of phrenology and brain anatomy had captured the imagination of the age, and the opportunity to study the mind of a man both brilliant and murderous was irresistible. Within days of his hanging, Edward's brain was removed and placed in the collections of Cornell University, where it was measured and displayed as one of the largest human brains ever recorded, over 59 ounces in weight, far above the average. To many, this became the perfect symbol of his life, a massive organ of intellect, yet twisted toward darkness. Some scholars argued that his unusual brain size explained his genius. Others countered that it proved nothing, that brilliance without morality was no gift at all but a curse. The brain remains preserved to this day, a grim relic of 19th-century fascination with the link between intelligence and crime. It is shown to students and visitors at Cornell, an artifact of both science and infamy, a reminder that behind the glass case once lived a man who spoke 10 languages, dazzled professors, and at the same time beat his wife, smothered his child, and left a trail of blood across New York. But Edward Rulloff's legacy is not confined to anatomy labs. His life became a staple of true crime literature in the decades following his death. Pamphlets, court transcripts, and lurid retellings circulated widely. Ministers used his story as a warning in sermons. Here was what happened when pride replaced piety, when intellect was cut off from God. Novelists used him as inspiration for villains, brilliant, articulate, and remorseless. His name became shorthand for wasted genius. Parents warned children against arrogance by invoking the genius killer who thought himself above the law. And yet, even among the condemnations, there was a persistent fascination. Some academics lamented his loss. They speculated about what discoveries might have been made had he lived longer, had his theories been completed. His unfinished manuscript on the philosophy of language was pored over by some who wondered if, despite his crimes, he had stumbled onto something profound. To others, this line of thought was obscene. What good was a theory on words, they asked, when the man who wrote it had silenced forever the voices of his own wife and child? The debate itself ensured that Edward's name remained alive long after the gallows had claimed his body. In Ithaca, in Elmira, in Binghamton, the memory of Harriet never faded. Her absence haunted the community long after Edward was gone. Some who had whispered of her murder decades earlier felt vindicated, though no body was ever recovered. Others regretted that justice for Harriet had been delayed, that the law had finally punished Edward not for his first atrocity, but for one committed much later. Families told their children that Harriet's spirit still lingered by Cayuga Lake, a reminder of the wife and child stolen by a man who believed himself untouchable. For criminologists, Edward Rulloff became an early example of what would later be called the criminal mastermind. His ability to manipulate, to cloak his violence in charm and intellect, made him a subject of study. He was proof that education and intelligence were no barrier to cruelty. In fact, in his case, they amplified it. His mind made him more dangerous, not less, because he knew how to deceive, how to intimidate, and how to rationalize his acts as steps toward some imagined greatness. The paradox of his life, genius and blood intertwined, was irresistible to writers for generations. His story fit neatly into the American obsession with crime and punishment, with the idea that anyone, even a man of brilliance, could be corrupted by ambition and arrogance. In this sense, Edward's life became a morality play. He was cast as the warning that talent without virtue is ruin, that brilliance without humility leads not to glory, but to the noose. Over time, his name faded from popular memory, overshadowed by newer crimes, newer scandals. But in academic corners, in historical societies, and in the glass jar at Cornell, Edward Rulloff remains. His life is still dissected in articles, his crimes retold in lectures, his brain pointed to as an oddity. He is not remembered for his unfinished linguistic theories. He is remembered for the violence that made his intelligence monstrous, and yet perhaps that is the true weight of his legacy. Edward longed to be remembered as the man who unlocked the secret of human language. Instead, he is remembered as the man who murdered his wife, his child, and a store clerk in Binghamton, a man whose brilliance was wasted on manipulation and cruelty. He wanted immortality as a scholar. He achieved it as a killer. The story of Edward Rulloff leaves us with unsettling questions. Should genius ever excuse crime? Can intellect ever outweigh morality? Is the capacity to reason truly the measure of a man, or is it the choices he makes with that reason? Edward's life suggests the answer is clear. Brilliance without conscience is no gift to the world, it is a danger. In the end, Edward Rulloff got what he sought. He was remembered. His name, more than 150 years later, still lingers, but not as he hoped. He is remembered not as the savior of language, but as the genius killer, the man who proved that even the greatest mind can be consumed by the darkest heart.